Hi everyone, Beth Ray here with MyCounselor.Online, talking to Josh Spurlock today. He's the director for MyCounselor.Online, and we're discussing the Affair Recovery Guide Part 6. This is how to relate to your spouse after the affair and the most common questions people have, and very real questions. So let's just get straight to it, Josh. The question of, should we separate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the questions that come right out of the gate, from the moment of discovery. And as is the case with most all of these questions, there isn't one right or wrong answer. And that's not a cop-out. It's just a recognition of the complexity of people's lives and situations, and that there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. There's a lot of variables about your life and your family system and the nature of what is taking place between you and your spouse that determine whether or not it's a good idea. But some starting places in terms of questions is, we want to know, is it safe? Is it safe for you guys to be in the relationship, in the same house, in the same vicinity? Is it physically safe? Is it emotionally safe? Are you able to be verbally respectful and not destroy each other those ways? Are you capable with the intense emotions and rawness of what it is you're feeling to be under the same roof with your spouse without attacking them, bludgeoning them, not being able to sleep, not being able to do good self-care, not being able to show up and parent the way that you need to? Those are considerations that you've got to think through in terms of whether or not to separate from your spouse, and further beyond that, whether or not to try an in-home separation versus an out-of-home separation. And thinking through, in-home separations create the opportunity to work through some of the difficulties that you guys are facing, and the makes it easier to have conversations and address the brokenness that needs to be addressed, can minimize disruption for kids and risk and financial stress. So there can be some benefits to an in-home separation, but we may not be able to do an in-home separation. Or at least temporarily, there may be a need to separate into an out-of-home separation if we can't be safe with each other, be under the same roof with the betraying spouse, or if the betraying spouse is unrepentant and unwilling to seek help. There may be a need for them to move out and to have that separation because of their unwillingness to own and address the breach in the relationship that they've created.
Okay, and I think this particular part of the article is very interesting to me because a lot of assumptions are made from people looking in on the couple that's going through this when it comes to whether somebody moves out, whether they don't. I know this is probably a very ignorant way to look at it, but I got to be honest, this is the way that I did, that if they stay together in the house after discovery or disclosure, they're going to stay married and they're going to work it out. If they separate, then that's just kind of a waiting room for divorce over there. They're just kind of, but am I right in saying that the way I read this, that that's not true at all? Sometimes separation just gives the other spouse a more healthy environment to process what they need to process.
Correct. That is completely true on both counts. It's completely true that that's not true at all, and that staying together under the same roof or doing an in-home separation is really no indicator at all as to whether or not the marriage is going to be reconcilable moving forward. Separating and being not under the same roof is no indicator whatsoever as to whether or not the relationship will be reconciled and can move forward. That the outcome for the marriage is really completely independent of the decision that we make about in-home or out-of-home separation as we work through it. And very often the case can be that the best thing, if we are wanting to reconcile the relationship, the best thing for that end is to have an out-of-home separation at some junctures. There may be a need for firm boundaries to be put in place, or it may be the case that a betrayed spouse is so hurt and wounded that they're not able to be under the same roof without being further destructive. and they need that space to be able to work through their own hurts and wounds in order to be able to reconcile in the relationship. And so what matters is, what are our goals and what are going to be the tools that we use to achieve them that are most effective.
The next part of your article, it's called "Should We Talk?" That's the next section, which was really, to me, I never really thought about the fact that people that are going through this, after the bomb gets dropped and you realize this is happening, kids still have to be picked up from school. You still have that 2 o'clock team meeting at your work that day. Life goes on, and you still are trying to make your life work together. And after all of this has happened, so just the idea of continuing the responsibilities of life, I mean, within an hour of finding out and onward, how do you answer that? Should we talk? How do we do this?
Right. And there's two ditches that we can get into. On the one hand is the couple that doesn't give each other space in order to process through what it is they're feeling, and they just go round and round like cats and dogs continuously. And it's super destructive, not helpful, doesn't help anybody heal, doesn't help move forward, doesn't help kids. It's just completely unhelpful and destructive. Then there's this other ditch where we just go into this avoidant denial place and stick our heads in the ground, into the sand, and ignore what's going on, silent treatment. We don't talk, we don't engage, we don't bring it up. There's just this cold silence, or this fake pretend, disingenuous going through the emotions of life without really dealing with what's going on, that rots us out from the inside out, and is destructive as well. So neither of those options are good. What we need to move towards is being able to have a healthy dialogue around the issues at hand, so that we can make decisions about how to move forward separately or how to move forward together, and what it will take to do that. So in terms of communication, it needs to happen. There's a good chance you're going to need some help getting there to where you can have healthy, productive conversations. But in the meantime, there's some rules of thumb that are good to follow. Things like, don't try to have conversations, if you're going to talk, between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m. They're not going to go well. It's predictable. We can know these things. Emotionally, we're depleted. Physically, we're depleted. Mentally, we're depleted. And we're not able to show up as our best self. We're not able to communicate in the best way. We're not able to perceive and understand in the best way. So it should completely be avoided. And it is okay to refuse to engage a conversation with your spouse after 9 p.m. and before 7 a.m. It's okay to say, I can't show up well, and I have to say no to engaging this conversation. And in fact, you have a responsibility to do so. You can't control your spouse, but you can exercise self-control. You have a responsibility to not engage a situation where you're going to show up poorly and you're going to cause more damage. And in blaming it on your spouse because they started the conversation at 10 o'clock at night is not legitimate. You have the responsibility to say, I can't show up well in this context at this time, and I need to not do this. So I'm going to exit myself from the situation in order to handle it in a healthy, mature way. Don't have conversations digitally. Don't text your spouse about the affair. Don't respond to texts to your spouse about the affair. Don't email about it. Don't instant message. Don't communicate through social media. That's not going to be helpful. It always leads to destructive. I've been doing this for 10 years. I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of couples, thousands of hours. It's never productive, and that for anybody. And you're not an exception to the rule. It's not going to be helpful to you either. Just don't do it. Just stop doing it, because you already are. I know that you are, because everybody does. And it's not helpful for anybody. So stop it. Do have conversations away from your children. Don't do it with them or in front of them. Do bring in outside counsel, bring in pastors, bring in mentors, bring in those that can be helpful in helping you facilitate that conversation. Do have conversations about getting together with a professional that can help you guys navigate through these kinds of things. And that's really, really important. And don't have conversations when intoxicated. Again, that's not going to be helpful to you. That you may feel like I'm too anxious or too nervous to have the conversation without alcohol in my system, but that is not going to help you or the situation. It's going to set it up um, for more difficulties and troubles. So it's important that you take steps to try to navigate this the best possible. It's always hard. It's always painful. It's always bad in that. But there are things that make it worse, and there are things that make it as good as it can be.
Well, speaking of things that are difficult to talk about, and certainly I would think this applies to Christian couples that are going through this, because not only is it a question that people really don't know how to answer, but they don't even want to ask, and that is, should we still be having sex?
Yeah, that's definitely a question, and people's response to that question when they haven't walked through this situation is usually typically very strong in one direction or the other, and that but there isn't a right answer to the question and there are two very normal responses, and it's normal to vacillate between the two. It's very normal to have an immediate response of, are you kidding me? I don't want to have anything to do with, I can't even stand the sight of my spouse. I'm totally not interested in having sex with them. And it's always the prerogative of the betrayed spouse to govern what kind of interaction that we have with each other. But that's one uh, response. But there's this other response that maybe surprises some folks, but is also really normal, and that is the desire to feel connected with their spouse and bridge the emotional distance and disconnect through a physical intimacy and physical closeness. And so it's common to want to be close, even though emotionally we're distant, to have some sense of stability. And it's not uncommon for when the relationship has been cold and distant and disconnected for a long time, and we've known that something's not right, but we haven't been talking about it, that when that finally gets out into the open, there's a sense of relief in that it's finally out there and being dealt with, and we're finally talking when we haven't been talking for years, and we can have a feeling of intimacy and closeness that's oddly around the intimacy of sharing this secret that's been out for a while or has been hidden for a long time. And there's a need or want or feeling closer because of that, and a desire to connect sexually. And it's okay in that. It's not wrong, it's not damaging, it's not destructive necessarily for you to do so. Where it can be is when we are engaging sexually for unhealthy reasons as a betrayed spouse, rather that as in an attempt to try to keep the betraying spouse from leaving, where we're afraid they're going to leave, or maybe we didn't have a good sexual relationship, and so we're blaming ourselves for why they had a sexual relationship outside of the marriage, and so we're going to try to fix that by engaging our spouse sexually. That's not helpful, and it's not healthy, and it doesn't fix things. Or under feeling of pressure or coercion from the betraying spouse, that's not healthy, that's not helpful. And so I would encourage that to not be the reasons why we would connect. But there isn't a right or wrong answer as to whether we should or should not.
The next question that you ask is, should I get tested for an STD? And the short answer is yes. And you
Yes.
give a great explanation of that. You also answer the question, is it bad to spy on my spouse?
Yeah, that's a big question, because betraying spouses are very typically very defensive. They've lived secretive lives. They've hidden this secret for quite some time, and they want to control the information that their spouse sees, and so they tend to be very defensive about this. But it is a healthy thing for a betrayed spouse to gather information, and that it is a healthy thing for you to be prudent and protective of yourself. In Proverbs says the wise person sees danger ahead and takes refuge. The foolish person goes blindly on and suffers the consequences. If there are things that are happening that are not appropriate and are damaging and destructive, it's prudent for you to look into those things and gather information. Now, there may reach a point at which that becomes not helpful for you, and we can become obsessed about those things, and counselor can help you work through where that line is at. But certainly on the front end, fact checking and seeing whether or not your spouse is being truthful and honest with you is a valid thing. And there should be transparency in a healthy relationship. We shouldn't have, where we don't have access to our spouse's phones or computer or social media accounts or emails or things like that, where things are super secretive. That's all sorts of trouble brews in those shadows, and creates opportunity for the enemy to get a hook in us in a way that's damaging and destructive. And so, no, it's not within limits and with caveats. It's not bad to spy on your spouse, and that as a betrayed spouse, trying to sort through what's going on in your world and figure out how to move forward and what it is that you need to do in order to move forward.
Well, speaking of moving forward, the next section of the article talks about forgiveness, reconciliation, and trust. And two of the points that you make about forgiveness that I feel like is very, very good. It again kind of plays into this false sense of urgency that you need to kind of figure out what kind of forgiver you're going to be in the moment whenever you find out. And, and there's two extremes. There's, the bridge burner, I call it, where it's just, no, you will never pass go again. Like, this is it. And then there's those that forgive too quickly. And you say how that is superficial and it leads to other problems down the road. But how can people... so you're saying it's okay to not have to make a decision on how to forgive right away.
What I'm saying is that there's a difference between forgiveness, reconciliation, and trust that oftentimes gets collapsed together for folks, that they see the three as being one and the same, and thus makes it very confusing and difficult to know how to proceed. Forgiveness is about the choice to let someone off the hook for the ways in which they've been hurtful towards you in light of God's great grace towards you. But it doesn't mean you're not angry, and it doesn't mean that you necessarily reconcile in the relationship in that. And so even if you are going to choose to forgive, and that in of itself is a process, it's a choice you make in a moment in time, but it's worked out over time in a process. That doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to reconcile. You may not stay married to this person. You may not continue a life together. You may choose to let them off the hook and still not be in relationship with them. And the decision to do so isn't necessarily fully based on your side of the fence. That it isn't wise to reconcile with a spouse who's not repentant, who's not willing to demonstrate repentance through doing the work of reconciliation in their life. And so you may be even willing to reconcile, but choose not to because of a spouse's lack of repentance and engaging that. And even if you do move forward in relationship and you do move to reconcile, it takes time for trust to be built. That you're not going to trust right away just because you've decided to work towards reconciliation. Trust is something that has to be earned over time and demonstrated by the betraying spouse with trustworthy behavior. So giving yourself space and time to sort through these different aspects of forgiveness, reconciliation, and trust are important. And prematurely jumping to conclusions on any of the above are not going to help you. There's a false sense of urgency that we can feel that we've got to in this moment, sometimes because we feel it within ourselves, sometimes because our spouse wants us to give an answer right away. Sometimes it's family, friends that think we're supposed to know the answers to these questions right away. But in reality, it's not wise to force yourself into making a decision in a short period of time just because others feel like you should or that you feel like you should. It's really okay to just acknowledge what it is you're feeling in the present, notice that, and to give yourself space to pray through that and talk through that with others, and to get counsel and figure out what to do with those things.
Well, I think if you could summarize all of these articles in one thing, which is very difficult to do because they have so much helpful information, but I would say it is take your time and get help, to have
Mm-hmm.
people get you through the process of what you're feeling, and know that you have time. You can take a step back and just feel whatever you're feeling and move forward from there. This is from MyCounselor.Online. You can find the entire article at MyCounselor.Online, and we hope you do and read the rest of the articles on there. We hope this has been incredibly helpful for you. This article is called Affair Recovery Guide Part 6, How to Relate to Your Spouse After the Affair. And if you need any help at all further after reading the article, our counselors would be happy to help you in whatever stage you're at. God bless you all.